if you're concerned about medical confidentiality as an abstract, let me just say, this is a privacy issue where lives are at stake. If people cannot trust that what they say to their doctor will be kept in confidence, then they will tend to withhold information. If they withhold information, they put their own health at risk, and possibly the public health at risk. So it's absolutely essential that we have the ability for a patient to say, keep my secrets. Any more information, please ask me in the poll afterwards. All right.
One of the key takeaways was one of the problems with the existing approaches is that they bundle identity with the network. And when I say identity, like information about you. So in many cases, your friends and family are being held hostage, and in order for you to actually kind of access that, you need to basically hand over information to let your kidneys get harvested. All right? I mean, that's a dramatization, but you're sharing too much information. There's one thing we're actually talking about. There's a few ways that which might help address some of this. The biggest one was the idea that if there's just because you don't need to actually share all the information to actually prove certain claims about your suitability for either a service or anything like that. I mean, the just 17 example, or the ones that we had from before. I mean, the really facile example would be if you can improve your age, you don't need to actually say give your date of birth. If there's a way for you to actually just say yes, I'm over 18, then that's really all you need for any services to actually work on. And if there's only one thing to kind of take away, it'd be really good to see more of that kind of claims-based approach, which disintermediates the facts about some data with the data that you're actually being sharing along with it.
I wanted to talk about it from the perspective of the Pirate Party, but it obviously applied quite heavily to the Open Rights Group. I wanted to know if it did apply to the Open Rights Group, essentially, if you wanted to get out of the bubble, blow a bubble up, or whatever else. We had a pretty good discussion that ended up covering a fair number of areas, including the reach that digital has got, essentially, in terms of the internet and all the rest of it. The fact that org is obviously hitting above its weight, and funding and all that kind of stuff, resourcing. But it was a fairly general discussion. It left track quite early on. But broadly about communicating the messages, the issues that we have to a broader group of people, politically or as activists, and try and make sure that people who don't currently see digital issues as issues that affect them, and how we can actually make them aware that they exist, and that they need to care about them, and maybe put them in a context that they can understand.
We discussed two broad areas. One is giving advice, on how to do how to make a proper FOI request, a freedom of information request, like what you should, how do you go about it, how broad, how narrow should be, taking into account issues around costs, and possible exemptions and reasons why you might be rejected. So we had quite a good discussion, I think, some practical advice, which I don't think, there's no point reproducing it here. But if you are interested, people from OR can probably help. And then we went into what are some of the current issues in terms of in the policy. And basically, the freedom of information is potentially under attack. But there has been a review where the government, despite all their talk about openness and things, they are looking at a couple of really bad things. One is at the moment, the cost for each individual freedom of information request are taken independently, but now they want to lump all the requests from a single organization in the same cost tab, which means that local newspaper, that contacts the council every day, basically with a different request, might soon run out of credit and have to wait a month or 2 months, before they can put another request. So that's quite bad. And that is, it's particularly bad because the government has been making some moves to open up freedom of information in the sense of making it the responses machine readable, for example, and trying to promote proactive disclosure in the field of open data. But it seems that what they give with one hand, they are now taking it with the other. And there is one area which is particularly problematic, which is the freedom of information around private providers of public services, where there are quite a few organizations right now in London that are very concerned about how this open public services, basically the privatization of public services, is putting whole tracks of public activities outside the reach of FOI, and therefore, the whole accountability implications are really, really bad. So, we are considering actually whether to join or form a campaign on that. And then the last thing we discussed, or I proposed, was that actually there is another development in the Public Sector Information Directive, which is about to be renewed this year. And now this directive actually makes all information that is accessible under Freedom of Information in Europe automatically reusable, which is one of the problems that people were having in terms of being able to redistribute and reproduce. So that is quite good news.
Password security and security, with quite a heavy focus on tools and techniques that are used to try and keep data secure. There's been a fairly large amount of high-profile data leaks recently, things like Tesco, Evernote, LinkedIn, and so on. And not only is your personal information at risk should an account get hacked, but if you're a journalist and you've got confidential sources, they could also leak. So we talked about a couple of ideas, such as LastPass, KeepPass, password hash, and then also other general forms of encryption or authentication, such as YubiKey, other two-factor authentication like Secure ID or Google Authenticator. If any of this interests you and you didn't attend, come and grab me in the pub.
The selling policies of the software providers, the terms and conditions you agree to, whether or not you've really actually agreed to them, the nature of open source compared to closed source software, and closed source is still obviously dominant, public providers versus private providers. Now, I'm just an ignorant accountant, and my software of choice is closed source finance software, so most of the discussion went completely over my head. They were using words I'd never heard of, Ubuntu and stuff, my lord. But we all shared a concern about the expectations that we had of the softwares that we were all variously using compared to the way that it had finally turned out. Our expectations had frequently been dashed. And we all shared that problem, whether we understood the word Ubuntu or MYOB or whatever else. And it seems that there is a common problem. It doesn't really matter which platform or which source we were talking about. When the terms are either amended or curtailed or unexpectedly withdrawn, we all individually suffer. And the problem essentially is one of standards and expectations when we buy or rent the softwares that we each use. Essentially, our meeting came up with a call. Perhaps as a way of increasing the profile of ORG, it should think about setting either a charter or a standard for fair use of secure software.
An American law which is worse than the Patriot Act. Why is it worse than the Patriot Act? Well, because most, but not actually all parts of the Patriot Act don't specially discriminate against you by nationality. But this law, FISA 1881A, if you're not an American and you're outside the US, that is to say the rest of the world, this law targets you. And it means that any data really relating to your political activities, or in fact just data about a foreign territory, is fair game under American law. And this has been the case since 2008, and it specifically can apply to cloud computing. So it's a law designed for mass surveillance of data in clouds in range of American jurisdiction. The other aspect, which is kind of disturbing, is that I've gone around telling European officials and data protection officials about this for the past 18 months, and indeed European civil society. And I've given rather detailed legal analysis to some of the greatest legal experts in Europe who say, my God, this appears to be true. Nobody in 18 months is doing anything about this. There are some amendments which I've managed to get tabled to the data protection regulation which might fix this in certain ways, but I'm having some difficulty in figuring out how to mount a campaign about this.